Okay. Somebody pull out the Google or something, or DuckDuckGo or whatever you use. I'm just interested now in who said that. But yeah, say it again. 10, the system set up, 10 guilty should go free.
10 guilty go free, then one innocent.
Before one innocent is condemned, yeah. And that's the whole idea, is be sure. Now this is, again, it's a biblical principle. It's not, this text is talking about evidence of a different form. But typically it's eyewitness testimony. And how often the Bible talks about in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word shall be established, right? And the idea is that it needs to be beyond question, right? Beyond reasonable doubt is the way that we put it, right? In modern jurisprudence. But that's a very, again, Judeo-Christian worldview idea. Now, verse 14 and 15, did you find it? I just want to put it on the recording.
Blackstone's ratio.
Oh, it's Blackstone. Okay, so I got a spiel on Blackstone. Okay, just saying. Well, I won't go off into it too deeply, but so Blackstone, and in other words, when you study the Founding Fathers, and I got a buddy who has done this, and because there's a lot of claims thrown around today that, well, the Founding Fathers really, in other words, we talk about the Judeo-Christian worldview as the foundation, right, of Western culture, Western thought, etc. And there's many that push back at that, and they claim, well, the early Founding Fathers, etc., were not actually that Christian. And, okay, yeah, there were some deists amongst them. They were absolutely. And they always are saying, well, then they actually got all our ideas of jurisprudence and law. They got their ideas from Rome and from Greece. I was taught that, in certain classes. They'll say, oh man, the Western heritage comes from Greece and Rome. Well, but if you go back and you study these guys, and Blackstone is a big one, who they're quoting, and I have a buddy who went and he went through all their quotations. And I have to look up the stats because I don't, but it was the vast majority. It was like either 60 or 70% of all their quotations were from the Bible. And it was like, in other words, what's their source that they're quoting? It is the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's my point, okay? Is like, it's not, and sure, they quote Locke and they quote, some other philosophers in Europe, and they're quoting, some Greco-Roman sources. But when you weigh it out, like the vast majority of weight is given to the Bible in their quotations. And so the point is, yes, the Judeo-Christian worldview is what influenced and created Western society as we know it. But, okay, I just feel better. I had to get that out, okay? I feel better. Moving on, okay. So, verse 14 and 15, let's just wrap up this section, and then we'll kind of come back and sink our teeth into the judge thing. But notice, in verses 14 and 15, the final case involving damages, and liability issues that is covered here is referring to hired property. That is, it's property either hired out or damaged in the presence of the owner. So the previous scenarios talked about, well, what if you loan something, or if you're borrowing something and it's damaged? Well, then who's liable, etc. Well, what if in this case you actually hire it out, or the owner is present when the property is damaged? Now, in this situation, notice that the owner, if the owner is present, it's assumed that he will watch over his own goods. In other words, if the owner is present when the damage occurs, then that's it. Like, they don't charge the guy who damaged it. And in other words, it's assumed that the owner is going to watch over his own goods, and if something happens to the owner's property, then the borrower is not culpable. So I think that's interesting, is it's still assuming the responsibility falls on the owner if the owner is present. And that's, again, as we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but the Bible is very nuanced when it comes to assigning responsibility, culpability. And it's a very important part of Judeo-Christian worldview that is being eroded much today, right? Everyone wants to deny responsibility. Well, it wasn't my fault. And we're always trying to push and blame somebody else. But really foundational to the Judeo-Christian worldview and to biblical law is the idea of genuine responsibility, culpability. And so, but notice, if the animal has been hired out, then there is no restitution. And I think this is interesting, is if you paid, in other words, it's not a borrow situation. It's not a loan, hey, I just gave you that for the weekend. No, you actually paid and you hired the property. Then, if it's damaged in the process, then again, I think it's interesting, in that situation, there's no restitution that needs to be paid. The loss to the owner is part of its hire. And the idea is this condition, of course, does not apply to the willful destruction of property, but to accidents or acts of God as they were defined earlier in the law in chapter 21. But the point is, if one rented an animal and then the rental fee itself was expected to include, quote unquote, in our modern term, insurance on the animal that was rented out. And so the owner himself must absorb the cost of the animal rented out that was injured or killed while under the rental contract. So as long as both parties knew that this was the arrangement, then the law was given to make sure that both would, right? That's the whole idea, that's the purpose of the law, is make sure that this was a prearranged understanding. But each knew where the risk lay. And this principle, for instance, still exists a lot today. How many of you have rented a car? Car rentals do this to you, right? That's the whole point, is the rental company insures the cars, yet includes in the rental price some of the cost for the deductible. So if you damage the rental car, well, then ultimately, you've already paid for that in the price itself. They count that into the equation. And so there's both risk and responsibility on both sides, which is included in the contract. That's the point. So again, I'm just fascinated over and over as we study biblical law, how nuanced it is, how concerned God is in his covenant community, that there's justice in everything, even down to a business deal, when you hire something out and make a contract with somebody else, that both parties are, they know where the risk lies, where the culpability, responsibility lies. Now, any thoughts, questions, comments on that before we go back and sink our teeth into verses 8 and 9 for a minute? Well, for a few minutes. Okay, so like I said, man, we only had like 3 verses to cover tonight, so it's given me a time to take a rabbit trail. So go back to verse 8 and 9 real quick. Now, notice it's in the scenario of someone, delivering to his neighbor money or something to keep, and if it's stolen, then if the thief is not found, verse 8, then the master of the house shall be brought unto the judges to see whether he has put his hand to the neighbor's goods for all manner of trespasses, whether for an ox, ass, sheep, raiment, any manner of lost thing, right? Then he is to come before the judges, and the judges determine who's the guilty party. Now, notice in particular, and I'm going to flesh this out with a couple other passages, and then I want to jump to a narrative passage to kind of make the point before we run out of time for tonight. But notice how often the judges must get involved in these situations. The whole point of these laws, right, from Exodus 21 to 23, is to create case law. It's giving judges the necessary information to take and apply in other situations. The case law is not exhaustive by any stretch, it's just representative, but the whole point of these chapters is to equip judges to judge righteously. Now go to Deuteronomy with me real quick. I do want to read those passages, Deuteronomy 16 and then Deuteronomy 25, where we've alluded to these before, but it's passages where God makes it a big deal to say, hey, in Israel, he says, you make sure that just judges are appointed. So Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18 to 20. Let's read that one quick. He says, judges and officers shall you make thee in all your gates, which the Lord your God has given you throughout all your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. You shall not wrest judgment, W-R-E-S-T, twist it. In fact, that the root word in that Hebrew word, the root behind the Hebrew word, it means to stretch, right? The idea is to stretch something, and we would say pull it out of context or twist or pervert justice. He says, do not twist judgment. Don't pervert the truth. That's the idea. And he says, he goes on to say, don't respect persons, neither of the wise, neither take a gift, for a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise. In other words, don't be bribed to, as he says here, pervert the words of the righteous. So don't be bribed either by an actual money bribe, a gift, or by the respective persons, where you're willing to pervert justice to appease a powerful person, right? Or again, you're making a judgment call based upon someone's social or economic status. He says, don't do that, right? So the idea of justice needs to be impartial. He says, verse 20, for that which is altogether just. And again, this is a good example of, in Hebrew, right, when they emphasize something, they just say it twice. This is tzedek, tzedek, right? It's just the Hebrew word for righteousness twice, right? That's the whole idea. And in English, it's translated altogether just, or the idea is it's trying to bring the emphasis out, that the word just or righteous actually appears twice in the original Hebrew. But the idea is be just. God says, I really mean this. Okay, that's the idea. Altogether just you shall follow. That, why? Notice the result. We talked about this a little bit on Sunday, last Sunday, when we talked about the prayer of David for Solomon in Psalm 72. So profound for a variety of reasons. We were looking at it primarily in an applicational sense for, David is the sage praying for the next generation. But notice, what is the precursor to peace and prosperity? Justice. Right? He says, he's praying, God, give wisdom to the king's son. Give wisdom to Solomon. Why? So that he can judge in righteousness. Why? So now the nation can enjoy peace, prosperity. The world will look at them and praise Israel as being, this mighty nation that has a God unlike any other. That's the whole point. Well, notice that's what he's saying here. He says, follow justice. And he says, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord gives you. In other words, there will be many generations that can enjoy the blessedness of the land if justice is maintained. If justice is maintained, a society can continue. But what happens when there's no justice? Society disintegrates. Right? That's the idea, is generations will cease because of the chaos that ensues. Now, same basic thing, just, Deuteronomy 25. I'm going to read one more verse. Deuteronomy 25, verse 1 says, if there be a controversy between men, they shall come into the judgment, that the judges may judge them. Then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. And on it goes. But notice, justify the righteous, condemn the wicked. And God puts much on this idea of judges, judging righteously. However, go back to Exodus chapter 22. I do want to point something out that is subtle. Some translations try to bring this across, most do not. But let's take a closer look in Hebrews 22, verses 8 and 9, where the Hebrew word that's actually translated judges in this context. Most translations will translate it judge or judges. But some will actually translate it God, because the word is Elohim. Elohim is the original Hebrew. Now again, like I said, most translations are going to translate this word as judges due to the context. Some will use the word God instead, so which is it? Well, those that translate it as God point out that the oath in verse 11 is the context. That's the more immediate context. And so the scenario being envisioned is that you are coming before God when you swear the oath. Now that actually makes a lot of sense. You can make a good case for that. So that is where, but I think I did a survey, I can't remember off the top of my head, I think there's only like 1 or 2 translations that actually translate it as God. Do you have, is it ESV? Okay, I was going to say ESV does. I can't remember if there is another one. Maybe Young's Literal Translation. Maybe, check your footnotes. I think a number of Bibles will footnote it, but I think I didn't do a percentage, but I think most of them will use the word judge as plural. Yeah.
Moses' father-in-law is the one that suggested that he appoint judges, so they had judges.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
To handle these other cases that weren't going to come before an oath thing.
That's right. And that's where, the argument, when people say, well, we're translating in this context, we're translating it as judges. And the reason for that is, remember, the word Elohim it's not a name, it's a title. And it's a plural, right? So when we say God, right, God is not God's name, it's a title, right? And the word Elohim is a title that means mighty one, or one with power and authority. That's the idea. the word is used in not many, but a few contexts, and this might be one of them, that's the point, is it can be used to refer to angels or even humans that have power and authority. That's the idea. And so the word itself is less specific than the word Yahweh, L-O-R-D, right? The Tetragrammaton, well, when that's being used, okay, that's the sacred name of God, right? The Creator. And so that's much more specific. But when Elohim is used, it can also be used to refer to false gods, right? So Elohim, because it's plural, you can translate it little g, s on the end, plural. All right, so it's because it's the same word that's used for false gods as well. So context determines how you translate it. And so this one is tricky. And like I said, I think ESV, and don't check me out, but I think there was only I think ESV was the only one, maybe one other, that translated it as God. Most will translate it as judges due to the context. But their argument is that those who translate it as judges point out that point out that a human judge is in some way appearing as a representative of God before the people. This is Paul's point in Romans chapter 13, that human judges are appointed by God, ultimately. And so as a result, there's that argument. They're saying that to come before the judge is, in a sense, particularly in ancient Israel, which was the bigger point that I'm going to make in just a second. Particularly in ancient Israel, tying off with what Simone said, is it was first advised by Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. Because remember, in the wilderness, got 2 million plus people, and Moses is hearing all the cases and all the complaints. And this is before he even had case law. Okay, so, remember that was back in chapter 16, wasn't it? 17, somewhere in there. And it's like, wow, when you think about, it was 18, just saying. 16 was manna, 17 is the water from the rock. I feel better. Okay, it's 18. But anyways, so the point is, the judges show up in chapter 18. The law doesn't even show up till chapter 20, right? So then they show up at Sinai, and God, you know the story. God comes down, 10 commandments are uttered. Now Moses goes to the top of the mountain. He gets the case law that we're in the middle of studying. But Moses didn't even have that. And he was burdened. It says, and it uses a really interesting word, Jethro does, when he's talking to Moses. He says, you will wear yourself out. And the idea is that you're fraying at the edges and everything is coming apart. The seams are showing, right? Everything's pulling apart. And he says, not just you, right? Because Moses was wearing himself out trying to hear all the cases for 2 million people. But he says, but the people are getting frustrated. Why? Because there's a really long line for people to talk to Moses. And so he's like, you got to divvy this out, right? You got to do a little delegation. And so that's exactly what Moses does. And we see that alluded to a number of other times. Deuteronomy chapter 1, Moses recounts that. And then we already read the other passages in Deuteronomy where God talks about judges. But the point is, in ancient Israel, these judges, the way God designed it, was that they would have the law of God, they would interpret the law, enforce the law, but when there was a situation that arose, remember this is Deuteronomy 19, where it says that when there comes up a case that's too difficult, that like between blow and blow, stroke for stroke, blood for blood, they can't figure out who is exactly the guilty party here, then they could always make an appeal to the Supreme Court, right? So the local judges would go to the high judge of the land, which is in the context of Deuteronomy 19 is probably a reference to the high priest. So they would go before the high priest, present the case before him, and then he would go to God. Because this was modeled by Moses. Do you remember this? Do you remember examples? There's 2 or 3 examples. My favorite is the daughters of Zelophehad. Remember this? Have you ever heard a sermon on the daughters of Zelophehad? It's a crying shame if you haven't. But let me just say, and it's largely my fault if you haven't. So now let me tell you about the daughters of Zelophehad. So what happens is in the inheritance laws, you pass on your inheritance, right? Because they divvy out the inheritance. Right, but it went to the sons. And so, because they're assuming in that system, the daughters, they're getting married off into other family units. And so they wanted to keep the family or the land in particular tribal families, so they tied it to the male bloodline. Okay, well then Zelophehad dies. and he has no sons. He has like 4 daughters, I think. He has only girls. So the daughters show up to Moses and say, well, what happens? Like, our inheritance that you just divvied out and you gave to our father is going to, like, it's gone. Like, we don't have anyone to take that. Like, who gets the inheritance? So Moses says, man, that's a really good question. And so he goes, well, God, what do you think? He goes directly to God, because Moses could do that, because he has, like, a direct line to heaven. So he goes to God, and God says, I like their point. He says, give it to the daughters. And say, and he writes a new law. And that's a really cool situation, right? I mean, I wish we had that Supreme Court, you know what I'm saying? But this is the way God set it up in the theocracy, is when there was a case, I don't know about that. Well, let's go talk to God, and God gives them an extra law. And so it's kind of a nice way to do it. But the point is, so many will argue that if you understand the way it worked in ancient Israel, the way God designed the system, then they'll say, well, coming to the judges in this sense is ultimately, it would go up the chain of command, and it was ultimately, it was an extension of God's own power and authority that he had invested in the judges so that they would read the word, know the law of God, enforce the law of God. When they couldn't figure it out, then they went directly to God and he could interpret it for them or create a new law. And that happens several different times. So that's kind of fun. But the point is, this position is particularly interesting in that it underscores the importance of human judges that realize they are not to define justice, but to seek to enforce God's justice. That's the idea, is that judges are not given the authority in ancient Israel to write law. Right? They don't invent new laws. They enforce God's law, and then when they don't have a law that covers that situation, then, they either can understand through principle, an application, or they go directly to God and get a new law. But the idea is that they need to understand that they're enforcing God's definition of justice. God's the one who gets to define that. Now, one of the greatest examples of this is in a narrative passage is in 2 Chronicles 19. Did you have a thought? Is that hand up? Yeah.
When you were saying that it goes back to the whole Elohim translation too, but when you were saying they were not to interpret law for themselves, but you use examples of case law from God, isn't that when Jesus in the Gospels, you're going to have to help me out, because I'm not going to be able to give you the address for these verses.
Understood.
But where Jesus is quoting the Psalms when he says, you say you are gods, you will die as men, and he's condemning the unjust judges of Israel.
Yep. Yeah, so that's John 10. That
I knew you'd know the address.
it's can we hold off on that one? Because that one opens another whole can of worms that I don't have time to work through in 17 minutes. But that is a good one. Yes, so because Jesus, and there's different interpretations of exactly what he's doing there. But yeah, in John 10, he quotes Psalm 82. And or 83. And he's making that, he seems to be possibly making that same point, is that the human judge was a representative of the divine judge, and so he says you need to pay heed to that. And so, but yeah, no, it's okay. I'm gonna let that one go for now. Okay, actually, I have taught on that in the past. If you're interested, in our Psalter series, as well as I think Life of Christ, we covered it as well, in short. But go to 2 Chronicles 19 with me for just a few minutes. I've only got about 15 minutes here, 16 minutes, and I want to explore this for just a second. I'm a big fan of Jehoshaphat. Now, Jehoshaphat is not a perfect king, but I love his reign for a variety of reasons, particularly 2 Chronicles 19 and 20. But Jehoshaphat, does anyone know, I don't think I put this in your notes, but Jehoshaphat, right, all the names, Hebrew names are so fascinating because they spell out a phrase, typically. But Jehoshaphat, do you know what that means? It's actually, his name is a play off the word. It means Yahweh is judge. Yahweh is judge, or something along those lines. Some will say Yahweh is just, but it's actually the word, Shaphat is the word judge, and then the Yeho is an abbreviated form of Yahweh at the beginning. So what's fascinating is that his name, and it bears one of the marks of what would become really what he's famous for. One of the marks of his reign is what I want to look at here in 2 Chronicles 19. But let me put it in context real quick. So Jehoshaphat was really a good king. If you remember when I taught through, we did an Old Testament survey. It's not original with me, but I hijacked it from a guy who was in a book. I really liked it. But he said all the kings get from a 1 to a 4-star rating. You familiar with this? You remember this? Where there's like 4 different ways that the kings of Israel are ranked, whether or not they're good or bad, right? Just kind of right off the bat. If they deal with idolatry in the land, right? So in other words, whether they're faithful only to Yahweh or if they use syncretism and facilitate false worship. If they get rid of the high places, and then the sin of Jeroboam. If they reject or accept the sin of Jeroboam. So the point is, there's a lot of kings. There's 22 kings in both the north and the south, depending on how you count them. Some kings, like if they reigned a month, do you count that or not? Some people don't. Like Zimri, right? He only reigns like a month. But you have 22 kings in the north and the south. All of them are bad in the north. Right? There's not a single good king in northern Israel. That's a sorry, chunk of history. And they exist for over 200 years. The northern kingdom, not a single good king. Southern kingdom is about half and half. All right, where there's half good, half bad. But out of the good kings that are labeled good, well, again, they have that 4-star rating. Some of them only get a 1-star. They're good, but not that great. And then you got 2-star, 3-star, and then you only have 3 kings that are actually ranked as 4 stars. And in other words, they pass the test in all 4 ways. Jehoshaphat's one of them. Now, the other 2, you remember? Hezekiah. Well, after David, because they're always being compared back to David. So yeah, I meant the descendants of David, Josiah. So Josiah is arguably, it depends on how you read the phrase, he's arguably better than David. Like the way he's compared to David, it seems like it's actually saying that he is better than David. Some will read it that he's as good as David or whatever, but it's arguable that Josiah was the greatest king, but he was short-lived. Remember, he died young in that battle against Pharaoh Necho. Yeah, that's why he was the best. Is he died young. He didn't live long enough to make more mistakes, like Hezekiah, right? It's like, oh, you lived a little too long, buddy. Right? It's like, man, you were so good there for a while. Anyways, Jehoshaphat was one of those kings who is favorably compared with David, but out of those 4-star kings, he was the one with the greatest weakness. You remember his weakness? He kept making alliances with the northern kingdom, the bad guys. His famous alliance was with Ahab. Ahab's infamous is a better word, probably. His infamous alliance is with Ahab, which is recorded in the previous couple chapters in 2 Chronicles. If you were to read like chapter 17, 18, it's recounting the story where he makes an alliance with Ahab. He goes to remote Gilead. He almost dies in the battle.
Well, wasn't Ahab like setting him up to...
Oh, yeah. Ahab was a dirty dealer. Yeah, it was terrible. Jehoshaphat barely makes it home alive from that alliance. He exports it. Or he imports it, rather. It's really a bummer, but remember, he marries his son. He wants to marry the royal line of Ahab. So Ahab has a wicked daughter. What's her name? You remember? Athaliah. And he marries Athaliah, and remember, Athaliah is the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. All right, so some 2 pretty wicked people. They have a daughter named Athaliah, and Athaliah marries into Jehoshaphat's line. Jehoshaphat marries his son with Athaliah. Now, if you know the story, that's beyond the scope of our time tonight, but Athaliah brings total disaster to the southern kingdom for a while, almost wipes out the royal line entirely, tries to seize the throne. It's a nasty period of history. What's that? No, Josiah comes a little later, but yeah, she killed all but, Joash, that was it, Joash. And so almost succeeds in wiping out the Davidic line entirely because she's married, right? So Jehoshaphat dies. Her husband takes the throne. He only rules for like 2 years and then dies. And so she uses that as an opportunity. And she steps up as the queen and she kills her own grandchildren. I mean, this is not a doting grandmother, if you know what I'm saying, right? I mean, she kills everyone that is anything to do with the royal line, but she missed one, right? I mean, she was the worst grandmother in history, but then she forgot a grandchild on top of it, right? I mean, it's like, wow, this is just awful. Anyways, so the point is, and we could go on, there's a lot of bummer alliances. Jehoshaphat will do this 3 times. He'll make an alliance with the northern kingdom. And every time it ends in disaster. Like it was like, Jehoshaphat, why didn't you learn the first time? Well, notice this is our chapter. Let me just read it. Our chapter is when he's coming back from the battle of Ramoth Gilead. He barely escapes the battle with his life. Ahab dies in the battle. Listen to this. Then it says, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, returned to his house in peace to Jerusalem. And Jehu, the son of Hanani, the seer, went out to meet him and said to the king Jehoshaphat, should you help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? In other words, that was his Achilles heel. That was his constant weakness. He would make an alliance with a godless king. And the prophet here says, stop doing that. Therefore, he says, is wrath upon you from before the Lord. In other words, you keep doing this, there is wrath upon you. You're going to pay for this. Nevertheless, I love verse 3. There are good things found in you, in that you have taken away the groves of the land and have prepared your heart to seek God. There's another passage earlier in 2 Chronicles 12 where it describes Jehoshaphat in a similar way, but the point is, he's praised as really being a good king, right? In Judah, he was administering Judah well, and he was godly, but he had this constant weakness of making a bad alliance. Verse 4 it says, and Jehoshaphat dwelt at Jerusalem, and he went out again through the people from Beersheba to Mount Ephraim, and brought them back unto the Lord God of their fathers. And he set judges in the land throughout all the fenced cities, or the fortified cities, that is the walled cities of Judah, city by city, and said to the judges, take heed what you do, for you judge not for man, but for the Lord, who is with you in the judgment. Again, I think this is fascinating. His pep talk to the judges is awesome. He says, be careful what you judge, for you don't judge for man, but for the Lord, who is with you in the judgment. Wherefore, now let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Take heed and do it, for there is no iniquity with the Lord our God, nor respect of persons, nor taking of gifts. Now, we just read the Deuteronomy passage, but he's basically quoting, if not quoting, definitely alluding to Deuteronomy 16. We just read that a minute ago. Moreover, verse 8, in Jerusalem did Jehoshaphat set of the Levites and of the priests and the chief of the fathers of Israel for the judgment of the Lord and for controversies, for when they returned to Jerusalem. Now again, get this, what did I tell you earlier? You remember the judges? He appoints judges throughout the land, but then he sets up the priests and the Levites in Jerusalem. Why? Because they're the supreme court. That's when the local judges has a situation too difficult for them to discern. That's Deuteronomy 19. Then they come and they bring it before the high court, which is the priests, and ultimately the high priest who can go to God with the Urim Thummim. So he says, verse 9, now notice he gives them a charge. He says, and he charged them, saying, thus shall you do in the fear of the Lord, faithfully and with a perfect heart. And the idea is a loyal heart that is exclusively loyal to Yahweh. So that's the idea. So you're not worshiping other gods. There's no syncretism. He says, verse 10, and what cause soever shall come to you of your brethren that dwell in their cities, between blood and blood, between law and commandment, statutes and judgments, you shall even warn them, and that they trespass not against the Lord. And so wrath come upon you and upon your brethren, this do, and you shall not trespass. And behold, and then he sets up Amariah, the chief priest, is over you in all the matters of the Lord. So there's the high priest at the top. Zebediah, the son of Ishmael, the ruler of the house of Judah, for all the king's matters. Also the Levites shall be officers before you. Deal courageously, and the Lord shall be with the good. Now, this is so interesting for a variety of reasons, but let me just walk you through this and then we'll be done for the night. But notice how Jehoshaphat, when he's coming back from the battle at Ramoth Gilead, he's confronted by the prophet, who basically says, you're in trouble, right? You're a good guy, you're faithful to the Lord, but you keep making alliances with godless people, people who don't love God. So he says, because of this, there's wrath upon you. Well, Jehoshaphat takes that very seriously. And I think that's the whole point of the text, is he responds to that, and he says, okay, man, this is, I'm making these mistakes, so I'm going to try and double down and make sure, and he starts this series of reforms. Now, we could spend a lot of time developing this, but ultimately what's happening is he's climaxing what David and Solomon in many ways started. Moses commanded, but David and Solomon really did a lot to organize this system. But now Jehoshaphat it had apparently fallen into disrepair. And there was a lack of justice in the land. There was a lack of knowledge of God in the land. There was a lack of good judges in the land. And so he wants to reform, right, to go back to the way it was supposed to be. He reforms the judicial system throughout his territory. And it says he goes from Beersheba to the Mount Ephraim. Now, again, if you remember geography, that's a little bit telling, because Beersheba is the southern boundary of Judah. That makes sense, because his kingdom is Judah. But he can only go as far north as Mount Ephraim. Why? Well, because that's north of that's northern kingdom. Exactly. That's out of his turf, out of his territory. But it says he goes and he draws them back to the Lord God of their fathers. Isn't that interesting? And then how does he do this? Well, again, I think that would probably include, teaching, preaching, prophetic activity, etc. But then he wants to codify that in a jurisprudence system that is back to the pages of Deuteronomy. And what's fascinating is if you study, and I don't have time to develop, I'm really out of time, and I can't wait. I can't wait to teach through the Kings sometime. All right, I'm a little infatuated, all right, with Israeli history and the Kings and the Chronicles. It's just some really good stuff. And archaeology, oh man, there's so much archaeology to attest to this time period. We could get lost for decades in just teaching through the Kings. It's so good. But the point is, if you zoom out and look at Jehoshaphat from the perspective of his reign, he actually was one of the more successful kings in Judah. Like, he had a booming economy, safe borders. He had, up till that time, really, not since the time of Solomon, had they enjoyed so much peace and prosperity as under Jehoshaphat. Now, again, Hezekiah, Josiah, they come later, but up to this point, Jehoshaphat is really reforming and restoring a level of peace and prosperity back to the land that they hadn't enjoyed at this level, to this caliber, since Solomon. And again, it's the same thing that we talked about on Sunday, right? The Psalm 72 thing. But the peace and prosperity, or the way that we put it, in modern vernacular, in American vernacular, liberty and justice for all. That's essentially what Jehoshaphat was doing. He was taking them back to the Word of God. He was installing judges that knew their place, knew the Word of God, that would enforce it, on the local level all the way up to the national level. Right? He had the Supreme Court set up with the priest, the high priest. He names the high priest Amariah. But he goes back to the way that God designed it in the beginning. And the result of that is, again, peace and prosperity. That was not unprecedented at his time, right? They enjoyed that under David, even more so under Solomon. But since that time, because after Solomon, remember, his son, we'll talk about a little bit more on Sunday, this coming Sunday, but Rehoboam, Jeroboam, nation splits, right? It's chaos in the north for a couple hundred years until they all die, and taken in captivity. But in the south, they have some good kings, some bad, but it's a shamble of what it used to be. But then you have godly kings, bright spots. Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, Josiah, that are bringing the people back to the Lord. They're reforming and enforcing God's law in a way that then what happens? God blesses. He just showers them with blessing. And it is so neat to see that. But, so the point is, this whole idea of a judge, and I'm not going to get too lost into this. We could get lost in modern politics if you want to, right? But the whole idea of a just judge is absolutely essential for a society. A judge that understands true justice, doesn't define justice or redefine justice, but has a clear understanding, enforcing God's morals, values. Like, there's peace and prosperity that can result from that. But the reverse is also true. When you have a lack of justice, when we have, do you have examples of that? People being, well, yes, sorry, I was talking biblical examples, that too, but a lot of modern examples. But do you have biblical examples of people being, taking bribes, perverting judgment, and circumventing the court of justice? Oh man, Ahab, right, is the prime example. Ahab and Jezebel. There you go. Like I said, we could go on and on with modern examples. But I think, again, whenever we see that lack of justice, what happens? The people mourn. Remember our study of the book of Proverbs? The people mourn. When the wicked are in rule, the people languish because there's no justice. And with a lack of justice, there can't be peace and prosperity, not on the same scale. So anyways, there's so much more we can talk about. I'm out of time, but do some homework on Jehoshaphat sometime. All right? He's really an interesting figure. A lot of good, a lot of bad, a lot of things we can learn from him. Okay? But anyways, thoughts, questions, comments? I'm out of time, but yeah.
I don't know my history on Jehoshaphat all that well, but you think maybe he was looking to unite the kingdom again?
Yeah, some will argue that. In fact, my prof calls him the Billy Graham of the Old Testament. I love that. But if you have no idea what I'm talking about, then don't worry about it. But no, Billy Graham was known for that. He came out of like the fundamentalist background, and he was very staunchly conservative, but he had this longing for unity. And so he got himself into a lot of trouble because remember he launched these big crusades, but then he would join hands with the Catholics, and then before long there were all these bizarre faiths being represented in his crusades, and to the point where it's like, okay, like he still preached a gospel message, but it was confusing all the other signals, right? Because he was uniting with people who denied the gospel. The very gospel he was preaching, they wouldn't believe it, but he was letting them open the crusade in prayer, and they were leading parts of the crusade. And so everyone's like, what is going on, right? And that's my prof, that's the way he puts it. Jehoshaphat's the Billy Graham of the Old Testament. Is he had this, he had a love and a desire for unity, but it got him into trouble. Is he went too far with it. And I think I think that's very possible, his motive, we're reading into it a little bit, but I think, God says that. You have prepared your heart to seek God. You're a good guy. You're faithful, but quit doing that. Right? That's what he gets in trouble for. So I think it's an interesting lesson for us, right? So the ecumenical movement.
Our desire for unity should never include compromise.
That's right. Yeah, we can't compromise truth for unity. Unity is around the truth. If we have to ignore truth or somehow redefine truth or compromise truth in order to have the unity, he said it's not worth it. Don't do it. That's right. Yep. Watch who you hang out with, right? Yeah. Run with the dogs, you get the fleas, as they say. So true.
Your mentor says it's how you finish.
Yeah.
He made mistakes, but if he didn't make those mistakes, he might not have set up all the judges.
Sure. Yeah. And there's an interesting cause and effect formula equation. Absolutely.
God, I messed up. What do I do now?
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Amen. And that's really his legacy, which his name means that, right? Yahweh is judge. And his legacy is this. And read the next chapter sometime. My favorite chapter in 2 Chronicles is chapter 20, where God delivers Jehoshaphat. It's a stunning chapter. And he's a good guy. He really is. He's an amazing king, but he has this weakness and this failure, which wasn't just in his lifetime, right? Because the whole Athaliah thing, he opened the door to generations of heartache as a result of that. And it's like, oof, ouch. And of course he didn't know that, right? He wouldn't have known that. But then now that he dies and he's off the scene, we can view history from a bigger perspective. We can zoom out and say, man, Jehoshaphat, man, you're really messed up there, right? It's like, but that's the hindsight, right? Hindsight's 20/20. That's the blessing of our perspective in history. We can see so much history has already unfolded, and we can watch and, weigh it, etc. But that's why I love studying the history books. It's so rich. So, again, before I die, we're going to talk about it. Okay, we're going to get to the kings of Israel. It'll be great. But all right, let's close in prayer and we'll wrap it up for tonight. Father, thank you so much for the time, Lord, as we contemplate your law, justice. Lord, as we think about specifically how you invest servants of yours to do the task of knowing and enforcing justice, how that is a sacred responsibility that must be held with the utmost respect and awe and even fear, as Jehoshaphat charged the judges. He says, you fear God, because what the judgment you make, God is with you in that judgment. And you be sure that you're doing it God's way. Lord, I pray that our modern judges would hear the charge of Jehoshaphat, that they would bend their ear to hear and to listen, that we don't have the prerogative of inventing and defining justice, but rather taking your justice and enforcing it consistently across the land so that the country, the people may enjoy peace and prosperity, liberty and justice for all. Lord, might that be a vision that our culture recaptures. And Lord, might we in our meager efforts be a part of that process to impact our culture with the Judeo-Christian worldview, to help them see where we come from and how to go back. Lord, help us, Lord, as individual Christians to know you, love you, serve you, to do so more and more faithfully each passing day, all for your glory. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
So I got an interesting email yesterday.